Hello, historians. This is day 38B. We're still talking about Middle Ages in the West, and we're talking about the Vikings. So let's see. They're also called Norsemen or Nordic, which means Northmen because they lived in the north. They were icy men and women and children. And then Vik, which is their word for a dwelling place near a bay. So they tended to live near the bays. We know people had to live near water, and the climate would be a bit more temperate if you're around the water because those sea winds would lessen the temperature a little bit compared to being inland. Originally, they were fishermen and farmers, and they raised livestock. Their reputation that we have for them in America is the Raiders. So you have football teams named Vikings, named Raiders, and this has to do with people who ended up settling in Minnesota from these Norwegian regions originally. And the Vikings lived in Scandinavia. Scandinavia refers to the four countries Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. How did they travel? Well, there were two distinct classes of Viking ships, the long ship and the Nar. And their ships were very effective. Notably, they could move effectively in shallow water, which a lot of the other groups of people had not figured out that technology yet. So they could actually land their ship right up on the shore, and they could raid very stealthily. So you wouldn't know they were coming because other kinds of ships that different invading forces were using at the time, you couldn't go right up to the shore. So you'd have to get into a rowboat, and then they would see you coming, and then they could put up their defenses. The Vikings were able to take over a lot of European islands, monasteries, and villages because of the surprise factor. The long ship was used for warfare and exploration, designed for speed. Long, narrow hull allowed it to travel in shallow water, as we talked about. The Nar was a slower merchant ship that had a larger cargo capacity. So what did the Vikings do? They did, sadly, trade slaves, and they would also exchange glass and spices. They were often middlemen for the use of slaves, but having any part in a slave trade is a dishonorable thing. So that's one of the ways that they were destructive. They loved to explore. Exploring is not destructive. They did create trade networks and settlements throughout Europe and across the North Atlantic. They got to Iceland, Greenland, and they even got to North America in the Canadian portion. Eric the Red got to Newfoundland, so that's interesting. Additional things they did, they built ships, obviously. Those ships that they sailed, the longboat and the Nar, they built. They also raided and pillaged. Sadly, they seized treasures from monasteries, towns, and churches, but ironically, through robbing repeatedly churches and monasteries, through the art and the scriptures that they would steal that were embossed with gold, they eventually learned the gospel, repented of stealing, and stopped doing it eventually. So through what they stole, they ended up learning the gospel. It's kind of interesting. Why did they raid? Just something to do for fun? Well, there was political instability in Scandinavia at the time. There wasn't really a central administration, and that made people feel less secure about the future, and sometimes less secure people will do things they shouldn't be doing. Scandinavia had a limited growing season, and they tended to have larger families, so they were just kind of looking to take care of their family. They were like, we can't get enough crops here, so we should go help ourselves. Perhaps they perceived that neighboring countries had extra. Perhaps they had a philosophy of might makes right, that if they could take it, they would. And then why else did they raid? Well, also Europe was weakened from within. There was a lot of political unrest and wars between neighboring tribes in Europe, so they just saw an opportunity. And Europe was increasing its wealth and its trading, so the Vikings noticed that Europe had stuff they wanted. There were lots of treasures, people were collecting treasures in monasteries and churches to the glory of God, but the Vikings saw this as